Hello and welcome to this very special presentation of the 9th Annual Albany State University Poetry Festival. And for this year, we are very privileged to have Pulitzer Prize winning and U.S. Poet Laureate Natasha Trethewey. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
And she's been so gracious after her reading, her wonderful reading. So I hope you guys get the DVD with the reading on it because it was great. And so she's been so gracious to give us some of her time and allow us to just kind of probe her mind. So we have a couple of questions we want to begin. Whenever I read your work, I always think of the combination of the lyric, the narrative frame, but it's the image that punches us in the gut.
Yeah,
so for our young writers, I want to know the way that you weave the lyric and the narrative frame and the image. How much of that is just second nature over all of your own reading and writing, and how much of that is you're actually specifically, consciously thinking about weaving these elements?
Well, I think that as a learner, as a young child, I was very visual. And so the image is the sensory detail that first comes to mind to me. And so I'm very focused on trying to make a picture in my head. Right. I first started writing about photographs in my first book because they were a way to sort of use some evidence, some documentary evidence, and to describe it. And then from there, I learned to take pictures of things in my head and describe them. I'm not always upfront conscious about the lyricism of a poem. I mean, the sort of sonic textures of the poem, the rhythm of it, the cadences, where I have pauses, where breath happens. But at the same time, even as I'm focusing in the front on the visual image, the lyrical part is working on me. I tap my foot the whole time. Right. I compose out loud the whole time because I have to hear the rhythm of sentences, which I'm very drawn to. And of course, the sort of the third part of that you asked me was about narrative, and I always loved story. Growing up, listening to stories, listening to my grandmother tell stories, you know, as you do when you're a child, sitting under their feet, you know, trying to hear everything that they could do. And so having the story part is very important to me, but I also know that because I'm so drawn to narrative and to story, I can have a tendency to be completely linear. Right. But I think it's the lyric mode that undercuts my sort of more pedestrian linear tendencies. So, for example, in Native Guard, I used a lot of traditional forms that involved repetition and refrain, so that I had to keep circling back. So even as a story was advancing, the lyrical nature of the form made me circle back.
Whenever I read your work, I'm always thinking, either consciously or unconsciously, about Saussure's notion of the sign and the signifier, right? And that whole notion that, at some level, language is about investigating the gap between the sign and the thing that it signifies. And particularly for the African-American aesthetic, right? The distance between the oppressive class sign, right, such as Christianity, and the distance between the sign, Christianity, and their behavior. With that said, there are two great lines that you have. One at the end of a poem that says, enthralled by a word to a word, and then the other is the distance between word and deed. So I guess my question is, looking at poetry as a battle over the context of a word, could you talk a little bit about how you are investigating words and what they mean when you're writing poetry?
Well, I imagine that the nature of that investigation does go back, as you say, particularly for me as a black person, and as a black biracial person growing up in Mississippi, having been named, having the language of not only custom but also law in the state of Mississippi name me. So that there were these words that I was enthralled to because they were the language of law. And so to try to push up against that, those things which are a kind of received knowledge, I think it's one of the reasons I spend so much time with the OED, because I'm interested in the history of words. You know, not just the most basic of their denotation, or even the connotations, the way we have sort of shorten them or use kind
Right.
of shorthand to use words. But I mean, it's like the story I told about finding out what the word native meant.
Right.
And I did a lot of that, going back to figure out where the origins of words were. In the poem I read, Miracle of the Black Leg, the most strange discovery for me was that that little black mark that we call a comma.
Right.
You know, its Greek origin is a piece cut off, and it does in a sentence pause us. It's that caesura, and so does every time I look at that black leg in those paintings. It's a thing that gives me pause.
Right.
It's like what Roland Barthes would describe, if it were a photograph, as the punctum, the thing that every time I see that, it takes me out of the painting and into thinking so much about history, about not only the history of the word, but the history of what was done in the name of certain words.
Right. Your work, particularly Biloxophilia, Native Guard, and even Thrall, not just rooted in history, but understanding how history contextualizes. So the question then becomes, how do you see your work functioning in a world now where we're beginning to get more and more historical amnesia?
Oh, yeah. You know, I write about history as a way to write about the present. I mean, even when I'm writing about the past, I'm always writing about the present. You know, another example, I mean, everything that I'm trying to say in Miracle the Black Leg is about exactly this historical moment. The way, you know, that, I mean, the Black Lives Matter movement. I mean, you can just put the heading over that poem. Because that's exactly what it's about. It's about how they plundered these bodies, you know, for their own improvement or usage or whatever. And it was sanctioned by an angel, you know, a disciple of God, you know, is telling us that this is the way that things ought to be. I try to write about history to fight historical amnesia. I mean, I do think that poems can do. My husband's a historian, so I know that not everybody, you know, and he's a 20th century civil rights historian. Not everybody's going to go out and read the next great book about the civil rights movement, but maybe I read a poem about a cross burning that happened because of voter registration. It's another way of trying to tell history so we don't forget.
Very good, very good. I want to switch course just for a second back to literary devices. You've talked about or referred to your work as elegiac. And so I want to talk a little bit about the elegy and how do you see that unfolding in your work, or how do you see your work responding to that?
Well, you know, Robert Haas famously in his meditation at Liegh McInnis wrote, a word is elegy for the thing it signifies. And so in that way, everything's kind of elegy, you know. I always thought that photographs were, because they capture and hold there a moment that is no longer. I mean, even the moment after the photograph's taken, that moment has ceased to exist. And also when you look at photographs, the one thing that they say to us again and again is that not only the documentary evidence of the person was here, but also they're no longer here, and that those in them are also going to at some point be no longer here. So I'm always concerned with what is slipping away from us in that way, and I see poems as a way of you know, giving us a momentary stay against the inevitable loss. For a moment, a poem can bring my mother back in language, just for a moment, you know, and then she's gone again. That's the place that if she still lives at all, it's in.
In the poem, in the language, I want to return back to just how you, the way you weave language. Beyond Katrina, your work, and then Jerry Ward's the Katrina Papers, they both echo for me Jean Thomas Cain. And Cain was wonderful for me because reading it as a college student, it was like, what is this? Is it a poetry? Is it essay? Is it short stories? And so it's that whole notion of it cannot be defined. And so I guess my question for you is, in the mixing of those genres, why did you feel a need to address that topic in that type of genre where you know you didn't feel the need to be restricted? You said, I'm going to write a collection of essays. It's just kind of all created in that form.
Well, yeah, you know, it just occurred to me that there were parts of that story and parts of the experience of the story, the emotional level of the story, that couldn't be told in prose.
Right.
It took the cadences of poetry, the absences and the silences of a poem to speak louder than some of the more filled out spaces of prose could do. It makes me think of, I think it was the photographer Stieglitz who said, if I could tell the story in words, I wouldn't need to lug a camera. But Susan Sontag, writing about photography, said, nevertheless, the camera's rendering of reality must always hide more than it discloses.
Right.
And so I've got pictures in that book, but I've got, as you say, poetry and prose, because I think I needed all three to try to tell the story, because there's spaces where some things I think can't quite go.
Okay. Yeah. So in telling the story, right, and types of genre compromises one may make in telling a story. I'm thinking about, say, okay, so Alice Walker's Color Purple being adapted to film, and I'm thinking about, of course, Native Guard being adapted, and also Biloxophilia being adapted. And so the question I would want to ask is, in those adaptations, were there things that needed to be compromised or lost, or how do you feel about those adaptations in a way that the seamless storytelling and imagery was able to be told in their adaptations?
Well, so Biloxophilia had two different adaptations. One was a symphony that a colleague of mine created, and there was a string quartet and one a soprano who did it. And, he rearranged things, left out some things. And then there was a theatrical production that the students at Hollins University did, and they had a poet helping them, T.J. Anderson, helping them arrange things, but it also included dance and everything. And there were great things about the choreography that they did with dance that I thought really added to it. But of course they didn't stick to the text of the poetry exactly. Sometimes they would repeat things or skip over certain things. And so, when you see that kind of thing happen, what you see is it becomes a very different work.
Right.
Native Guard was different.
Right.
So what they did with Native Guard was not an adaptation at all. We started calling it a theatrical installation because they literally read the book from cover to cover.
Okay.
And there were four cast members, really. There was a woman who sort of played the poet, or me.
Right.
There was a young man who played the Native Guard, and so he read, recited the soldiers' parts. There was a wonderful singer who gave, and a composer who played with her, who gave music to the many places that I quote, like Nina Simone or Poor Wayfaring Stranger. And they added in a place where you might hear Dixie come in. I mean, strange things like that. But because they did it in the exact order, and because I think it added to it. I thought it made it wonderful, especially for people who might not have thought they wanted to sit down with a book of poetry.
Right.
So they get to watch something. Let me stop and say, when they first approached me about doing it, I said, I read my poems pretty well. Why would you need to get someone just to read my poems? How is this going to be any different than me standing in front of an audience? Right. But it was, because then there was the whole stage set. There were ways that just a little bit of dramatization. And I would weep every time I heard Nicole sing Poor Wayfaring Stranger. It broke my heart thinking of my mother. And every time there was a moment where the guy who played the Native Guard would be sitting in the audience in what looked like street clothes, except he had a jacket, and he would stand up when it was time for him, and he would put on that Union jacket and button it up, and he would march down onto the sort of stage area and begin. And it was as if a ghost, of some soldier walked into that room, and it was... You can't, as great as I might think that, the book is just the words, there's something that theatrical installation added to it. And I didn't feel like we gave up anything. If you give up anything, it's the connection that the audience might make with the real person.
Okay.
Who's, I mean,
Right.
you know, January, the actor who was sort of playing me, it's not her mother
Right.
that she's talking
Right.
about.
Right.
And I think there's a little bit of difference when
Right.
you're standing up there and the people in the audience realize that that elegy you're reading is about your own
Right.
mother.
Exactly.
And not
Exactly.
playing a part about
Exactly.
it.
Exactly. You've been quite open about in lauding about how important Rita Dove's Thomas and Beulah was to you, and how winning the Pulitzer Prize was continuing that torch. And so, could you talk a little bit about how and why that's important to you as a writer? Because one of the things I always tell people that arrogance is the product of ignorance. That you cannot be arrogant if you know history.
Right.
And so talk a little bit about how, having been, you know, along with others, but being so moved by Thomas and Beulah, and how you felt that was important for you to continue that.
Yeah, my father gave me that book when I left Hollins. I'd done a year in the MA program there, and I was on my way to UMass for my MFA. And you know, it was 1990, so she had only won the Pulitzer for it 3 years before, you know, in 1987.
Right.
So the book was still very new, and he gave it to me, and I remember reading it and thinking, I felt so connected to the story she was telling, because, you know, for a long time, I'd felt that the world of my grandmother and the people of her generation, you know, people who were born in, like, you know, 1905 and you know, 1916, they were dying, and the community down there was changing so much, and I started just wanting to record those stories. And so then I saw Thomas and Beulah, and here she is telling this story. She's got a timeline, so it enlarged the story of her grandparents to not just her and her grandparents, but how these people were part of history, and their story was the larger history of our American story, and you see that, and you realize that, you know, what feels very personal, what feels like, oh, I want to remember and record everything that my grandmother says. My grandmother just doesn't belong to me; she belongs to history, and there's something larger. That's humbling, you know. But I was so moved by that I at that moment sort of said to myself, I've got a book like that in me. You know, I don't know what will be my story yet. But I knew it had something to do with my family. And so domestic work sort of comes out of reading Thomas and Beulah. A lot of the poems are direct imitations. I mean, I sort of borrow the first line and shift it around and go off into
young writers do.
Well, I think old writers ought to do it too, because I think it opens the door for into your own stories. I mean, we're different people, so I'm not going to write the same thing. It's just it's like form. You know, I didn't invent the sonnet, but if I write one, if I use an old form like that, it's my own material that goes into it.
Exactly. Thinking about that, and thinking about the whole, listening to you talk, I'm thinking about Stephen Henderson's book, The Militant Writer in Africa and America. And I was in college, and the term, and I've been using my entire life. In fact, I titled one of my collections of poetry after the term linguistic liberation. And that was the role of the poet, is to engage in linguistic liberation. That's what draws me to Black's Ophelia, was that what you are painting for me is a person who would not be defined. She was defined, right? No, not that shoulder, this shoulder. No, you're going to get the shoulder I give you.
Right.
And what it really said to me was that no matter your condition, you can still control your dignity. You can't control anything else. And so I want you to talk a little bit about how conscious of you that you were painting dignity when you were painting Ophelia.
You know, I thought when I was working on it, that, you know, all the books you read when you're working on something, you know, I read Shirley Ann Williams, you know, both her slave narrative, but then her poems, Letters from a New England Negro. What I was thinking of, I was thinking of a neo-slave narrative. I mean, I really saw that as a neo-slave narrative, because it really was the key to her liberation was that she had this voice, that she was able to write these letters and to be defiant about the way that she was being looked upon by society, but more specifically her father at some point, her friend who was a school teacher, the men who come into the brothel.
Right.
I mean, she's always being named.
Right.
She's always being framed and positioned.
Exactly.
And what she tries to do is to move herself out of that. And I think she does it by with language. She does it by she keeps in mind this idea of bettering herself, and to her it comes through from reading, from what she can read, how she can write, and from that how she may stand up inside of herself. I mean, it reminds me of my grandmother, because my grandmother was a proud woman. This is a woman who just lived through Jim Crow. But there would be moments, I mean, even toward the end when I'd be wheeling her around in her chair, if she had been tired or slumped over, if she got in somewhere, she would sort of stand up in herself like this.
Exactly.
And it's just that idea of just there's a way that she's still going to present what she needs to present. And Ophelia was struggling with that because at first she was so burdened by the gaze of others upon her. It's only when she breaks out of that.
Exactly.
Which is why at the end of the book I have her marching right out of the frame, including the frame of the book that I've put her in.
Right. Exactly.
I like to say I have no idea where she went.
There you go.
Yeah.
There you go. She paints. She almost becomes a photographer.
Yeah.
By the end.
She's taken the last picture that we see, and then she's taking the last picture in one of her persona poems, and there's that last poem where she's being photographed, but it's from a time earlier.
Exactly.
But it's the moment that she realizes she's going to take charge of. Yeah. She's not going to be the object of someone else's gaze. It will be her subjectivity that.
So that it would be her controlling the picture that others see. Yeah, exactly. I want to end with I always have to return to a question about writing and something that for you, looking at young writers, right? What's the one thing you want some 12 to 15-year-old, or maybe even some college student says that I want to be a writer? What's the thing that you want them to know most?
Usually when I get a question that's similar to that, it's not that question. That's a better question. What advice would I give? And I say things like, read the OED, find those poets you love, and let those great poems be your teachers. But what I would really want them to know is something about how to find a way to make language a thing that works for you rather than a thing you try to hide behind. I feel like there are a lot of young poets who are playing with language in very clever ways as a diversion from actual emotion, from being willing to dig deep
and be vulnerable
and to talk about the things that hurt, that are difficult. Charles Wright, in his introduction to Best American Poetry a few years ago, said something like, he wrote, cleverness doesn't endure, only pain endures, and the rhythms of pain. And I'd like for people not to be afraid to find those places and to use language as a tool to help bring it about and not to hide behind it. I think that, sometimes I say that to my students, and they think, well, you're such a drag, because why do I want to think that everything is about pain, or why is everything about loss? Why is everything elegiac to you? And what I tell them is that, joy is that much sweeter because the other side of it's pain. And once you've known pain, it makes the joy a whole lot better.
Very good. Very good. So we want to thank you for not only the wonderful reading and not only taking this time for us, but we want to thank you for continuing to be a wonderful educator. Not just about how to master language, but how to use language to educate and heal.
Thank you.
So thank you for participating in the 9th annual Albany State University Poetry Festival. Please pick up a copy of the DVD and also come, because it is an experience for your mind and your heart. This is Liegh McInnis for Natasha Trethewey. Thank you and good evening.